Hello everyone, happy Monday and welcome to the first day of the Canterbury Tales. I hope you're as excited as I am. So the Canterbury Tales are often sort of held up as sort of the one text that we think of when we think of Middle English literature. When we think of medieval England, we think of the Canterbury Tales, and not for no reason. The Canterbury Tales are a really important piece of literature in the English language canon and the medieval European canon. It's a really dense text, as you may already have discovered. It's got a lot of stuff going on. It has a lot of real thematic stuff that we can play with. And it's also probably something that you have encountered in your life already at least once. I can almost guarantee that if you were educated in the American high school system, whether that be public school, private school, even homeschool, you probably have encountered the Canterbury Tales in one form or another. There's a good chance you've already read them. And even if you haven't, it's really hard to avoid running into the Canterbury Tales just in everyday life. If you've ever seen A Knight's Tale, the Heath Ledger movie, that's based on the Canterbury Tales. Based loosely on the Canterbury Tales, but based on the Canterbury Tales. So I'm really excited to read this with you this week, and let's go ahead and get started. So today you will want some note-taking materials, and I don't have the page number listed here, but the story does start on page 1701. Now, that's not where the story itself starts, that's where the introductory material starts, but hopefully you're reading the introductory materials as well. Because they can help give you important background in a similar way to what this lecture is going to do. So a little bit of cultural and historical context for you. This was written during the 14th century, so during the 1300s, and this was a really tumultuous time in England and in Europe at large. There was just a lot going on. There was what we call now the Great Western Schism, and that had a lot to do with different influences and forces at play in the Catholic Church. And it also had a lot to do with some various heresies of the time, specifically the Lollard heresy, which had a lot to do with the selling of indulgences, which if you grew up with a religious education, you know what I'm talking about when I say indulgences. So in addition to that, England was at war with France. Again, England during this time is almost never not at war with France. And specifically during Chaucer's life, they were involved in the 100 Years' War, which, as the name implied, lasted for more than 100 years, about 116. So religiously, politically, militarily, there's a lot going on. There's also a lot going on economically. During this time period, partially because of the plague, the Black Death came around during Chaucer's life and killed, between a third and a half of all of Europe. So that seriously altered the landscape of Europe in terms of economics. And that was one of the sort of core influences in the development of the middle class. Now, there had already been in Europe what we would consider a sort of blue-collar working class, where they're not peasant farmers, they're not the rich, they're not the nobility, but it's people like, tanners, carpenters, merchants, shoemakers, brewers, those sort of tradesmen and craftsmen and merchants, people who have a trade, people who have specialized education, and because of that are afforded a better position in society than their subsistence farmer brethren. But what we start to see during Chaucer's lifetime is the beginnings of a white-collar middle class, and it's actually that life into which Chaucer himself will find himself. He will be born into the kind of tradesman class, and he will find himself in the first kind of glimmers of a white-collar middle class. So Chaucer himself was born around the year 1340, 1341, and he died in the year 1400. He was born in London to a family of vintners who earlier in their kind of family tree had been shoemakers. The word Chaucer actually comes from the French word for shoe, chausse. Sorry, my French is pretty rusty. But that's what the word Chaucer, the name Chaucer, means. But his father and grandfather were vintners. They made and sold wine. So they were from that merchant class. And so he was already part of this burgeoning middle class, and as a young boy, he was placed in a noble household as a page to learn to be a personal attendant. So during this time, this beginnings of the middle class were still very tied to the nobility and to service in the nobility. But ultimately, Chaucer would become sort of a courtier, but also a diplomat in the court of Edward III. So really that's where during this time period, if you were going to have a career in things like law or diplomacy or writing, administration, finance, things like that, you would ultimately find yourself in the service of the nobility or of royalty. And so that's what Chaucer did. And if you know anything about Shakespeare's history plays or just about the history of the time period, the name Edward III will look familiar to you. It was his death that spurred a period of kind of intense instability in England that would eventually lead to the Tudor and Elizabethan dynasties. But Chaucer was also close friends with and patronized by John of Gaunt, who was also a member of the royal family. Now, during this time period, most artists who made a living through the patronage system, whereby someone really wealthy, someone powerful, would sort of keep you on retainer. They would pay you to create art because that gave them the reputation for being a very cultured person, but then also that gave you as the artist a way to make a living. And so not only was Chaucer part of this kind of diplomat, white-collar sort of royal serving middle class, he was also part of this artistic patronage system. So he was both diplomat and artist. Mostly he saw himself as a diplomat, though. He kind of personally saw his writing as something he did on the side. But it is notable that he was also part of this patronage system. So here's a short list of Chaucer's works. These are all of the major ones. The first book on this list, the Book of the Duchess, was actually written for his patron, John of Gaunt. It was written on the occasion of the death of John of Gaunt's first wife, and it's this really beautiful allegorical story that sort of traces her life and then kind of her experience in the afterlife. And this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it is notable that despite all of our misconceptions and stereotypes about this time period, the existence of and the continued existence of books like the Book of the Duchess not only points toward, kind of the chance and the care that was taken to protect this book through the centuries, but that it was created in the first place reminds us that the concept of romantic love, the concept of romantic marriage even, was not, and I will say again, was not foreign to these people. Romance and romantic love during the Middle Ages was a lot more common than I think we are still led to believe. And actions like this, like having someone write a book about your dead wife, really does point to this concept that this kind of romantic devotion is much older than we give it credit for. These kind of enduring relationships and marriages, this enduring affection and love is not a new concept, no matter what we are tempted to think about this period. Now, it is true that people had different conceptions of romance and of love in this period, but never think for a minute that marriage was only ever for political gain or monetary gain during this time period. So that's my rabbit trail on the Book of the Duchess. It's a weird book, it's an allegory, but it is really beautiful. Chaucer was also interested in the sciences and philosophy. He wrote a treatise on the astrolabe, which is a scientific instrument. And then Consolations of Philosophy was a really famous philosophical text. He wrote Troilus and Cressade in the 1380s, which is actually a story about the fall of Troy. It's an epic poem. It's a little dense. It's not as reader-friendly as the Canterbury Tales, but it is good. And finally, he wrote the Canterbury Tales in 1392, or at least he started the Canterbury Tales in 1392. As we'll see here in a minute, there is some discussion of whether he ever finished the text. But before we get to that, I want to take a brief detour into Middle English, because you've probably noticed by now that it is hard to read. It kind of feels like one of those dreams where you almost recognize everything, but you don't really recognize anything. Everything is almost comprehensible, but not quite. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason for that is the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift was an evolution of the English language that took place from 1400 to 1700. Now, during this time period, people were already speaking what we now call Middle English, which was a blend of Old English and Old French that came out of the Norman invasion of 1066. Remember that before that, everyone was speaking the very Germanic Old English, the language of Beowulf. And after 1066, when the Normans invaded England, the two languages sort of started to intermingle and intermix just like the people did, and we ended up with Middle English, which on the page looks so close to modern English, but when you try to read it, a lot of things just don't quite gel. And that's because partially of the Great Vowel Shift. And the Great Vowel Shift is important, but there are ways to kind of get around this, and I'd like to talk about some of those. So one of the best ways to kind of visualize this actually comes from Wikipedia. This is the first 18 lines of the general prologue. And we have the Middle English, a word-for-word translation, and a sense-for-sense translation. And the original of the first line reads as follows. When that April with his sure soot. So you can already hear from that it's similar to what we're familiar with, but not quite. When I say, when that April, you can hear me say, when that April, with his, sounds just like with his, but then I get to shures sot. And sure sot, when you see it on the page, it kind of looks like the words showers, showers, and then this kind of looks like the word soot rather than sweet. But when I say it out loud, I say shures. And again, it almost sounds like showers, but it is significantly different. And then sot, again, almost sounds more like soot than sweet. And that's part of this vowel shift. So here are some ways that you can kind of think about how to get around these issues of translation when everything seems close, but a mistranslation can kind of hang you up a little bit. And I'm going to post this website on our class page, but she gives some really like a nice bullet list of strategies that you can use to really understand the Middle English. And one is to read phonetically. And so that just means to read kind of just what you see on the page. Don't try to guess, just kind of read what you see. So for example, if I say showers, that looks like the word showers to us, right? Because today, OU makes an ow sound sometimes, showers. And then soot is, it's still tougher, but we'll get there. So number 2 is to read aloud. Again, when I said it out loud, when that April with his sure soot, it sounds close, pretty close to what you'd expect it to. Another strategy is to pronounce all the letters, right? And again, this is not what the original vowel sound is like, but if you're pronouncing all of the letters, you hear showers, but then also you get things like E's on the end. You want to pronounce those. Soot, root, and that gives you a more accurate translation. Reading logically helps. So, for example, it's unlikely that this means soot or sooty, right? Because when that April with his showers sooty, that doesn't make any sense. So you know that this has nothing to do with like the ash from a fireplace. It's got to be something else. So reading logically, reading in context is really going to help you. Reading with the Old English Dictionary is really helpful. The OED has a great free website, and you can just look up, the Middle English words. You can look up the original usages of words, and there's also a Middle English dictionary that you can use specifically for Middle English words. And finally, annotate your text. If you have a question, mark it down. If you think you know what a word means, mark that down. Once you figure out what a word means, mark it down. If you need to do some translating as you read, if you need to do some summary, this is the time to really dig down and spend a lot of time annotating, because it will help you later and it will save time later. So we're actually going to end this video here, just in terms of general context, and we're going to pick up in part 2 with the context of the story itself, and then a brief discussion of manuscript production as it relates to how we ended up with the Canterbury Tales that we have today.